Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, part 3 of our series on sacred threads. Welcome back to the No More She broadcast, where we're continuing our series on sacred threads with part 3. So we come to this passage in Ezekiel 13, verses 18 to 20, and it says, "Thus saith the Lord." Of course, this is what Ezekiel's being told to do. And one of the things that is amazing about the book of Ezekiel is this idea that God is constantly telling Ezekiel, I want you to do all these things, and I want the people to see what you're doing. I want you to explain it and they understand it so that the people may know that I am the Lord. So, this is what's going on. I want you to do these things, and I want you to explain it and open it up so they can see it, visually understand it. And I want you to do all these crazy things so that they may know that I am the Lord. And so he says, and say to them, thus saith the Lord. And he switches the gears here, and this is quite interesting because a lot of people have not focused in on this. And it's interesting because, the patriarchal world, and there's not a lot of focus on women. And there is quite a bit where God does speak through women and choose to use women. And not only as prophets, but as people in which God chooses to minister and speak through them in vast ways. And I would highly encourage you to check out the works that are related to that. But here he's going to turn to women in the ancient world who were doing certain aspects of divination. And he says, woe to the women who sew magic bands upon all wrists and make veils for the heads of persons of every stature in the hunt for souls. So this is quite an interesting passage, and I don't have time to unpack all of the context here. Before we dive into this passage more specifically, I do want to do a brief survey of the scholarship on who are these women. I mean, we have these women who sew magical bands, and what are we getting at here? And let's just survey some of the scholarship on how they view these women and what's going on here a little bit. So Greenberg in the Anchor Yale Bible Commentary, basically it's fortune tellers engaged in some sort of hocus pocus. Ronald Hals he does this as making black magic. We have Zimmerly as performing minor mantic acts and magic. We have Eicherud as women who deal in magic on the sly, and insolent woman soothsayers engaged in heathen demonism. Joseph Blankensup as women who are involved in the occult. And finally, interestingly, Hamori in her book on women's divination in biblical literature, she's saying that not many have really looked at it as actually being something along the lines of necromancy. And I find that quite fascinating, what she does with this text. So let's get into this. Obviously, for our context, we're going to start off with magic bands upon all wrist. And so this is kind of like the opposite, or, we have Christ and Antichrist. We have the tefillin, which is what was worn in worship and prayer, right? And all this communion and participation with Yahweh. And then you have these women who are using magical bands. So they're using them on the wrist. And they also have veils that we probably won't cover much. I'd love to, but we don't cover much in probably these episodes. But on the heads of persons of every stature, and they're hunting for souls. And so this idea is that they're using magic, and there's a couple of ways you can understand it. These bands, again, reflect what's going on in the ancient world, that you bind these bands about your wrist, and they're bound about the wrist, and what they do with them in juxtaposition to them trying to do something that we're going to talk about in a moment on the communion of saints. So I don't want to get into that too much. But this is where we're headed. This is an exciting passage. Will you hunt down souls belonging to my people and keep your own souls alive? Talking about souls of the dead. You have profaned me among my people for handfuls of barley and for pieces of bread. These are barley and bread that's talked about here is used in the ancient world, again, for divination. So putting to death souls who should not die and keeping alive souls who should not live by your lying to my people who listens to lies. It's all lies and deception that's going on here. So quite interesting. Again, he brings it up. Verse 20, therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against your magic bands, which you hunt down the souls like birds, and I will tear them from your arms, and I will let the souls whom you hunt go free, and the souls like birds. So this is amazing what's going on here. Okay, so you, again, go back to Ezekiel, the previous section in chapters 8 through 11 where God leaves and he's gone and he leaves the temple. So this is the point at which the presence of God is depicted in the Bible as leaving. And Ezekiel is sitting in Babylon. He's sitting along the river. He has this vision of God coming to Babylon. Why? Because God has left Jerusalem. He's left the temple in Jerusalem. He's no longer there. And Ezekiel, it's interesting. People visit Ezekiel on a regular basis because they're all in exile. So you have the 3 exiles that take place where the leadership is taken from, like Daniel, the best, the brightest, and all the leaders, the king, taken from Jerusalem to Babylon in captivity. They've been exiled. And so they're all in Babylon. Now, there's still quite a bit of people back in Jerusalem, back in Israel. And they're trying to get news. And it's going to take, 6 months or more for news to travel from Jerusalem to Babylon through messengers. And so they don't know what's going on. And, they're all in Babylon and they're wondering because what happened? Why did the Babylonians attack? Why were they able? And eventually, obviously, the temple's destroyed. And, they're going to have to explain that one. Why was the temple destroyed? If God is there and God's in the temple, why was the temple destroyed? Because God, he's the God of the universe. Well, God left in disgust. And what was going on? And Ezekiel is actually given. It's almost like Ezekiel is in Jerusalem. We know he's not. So he's not in Jerusalem. But he's in Babylon, and God shows up in Babylon and says, "Hi, Ezekiel, here I am. I'm not there anymore. I'm with you. I've left there and I've come here because this is all by my design. This is not because Marduk is greater. Okay, this is because I've allowed this to happen and I'm in Babylon." And I'm reminded in Samuel, 1 Samuel 5, when the ark goes to the Philistines, and what all happens there. Well, it's a crazy story, but, and the Israel thought, well, here, we'll bring the ark and then we'll win the battle. And they lose the battle. And, well, the temple gets destroyed. The first temple, Solomon's temple, is destroyed while they're in exile in Babylon. And people don't know what to do with that. And so they also don't know what's going on in Jerusalem. And when you read Ezekiel, it's like he has all these visions as if he's walking around the streets of Jerusalem, but it's even more than that. Because Ezekiel can kind of like do almost what Dr. Strange does and kind of like peep inside and see all kinds of things that are going on. He sees what's going on inside the temple. He sees that God has left and God slowly kind of, the narrative is cool. How slowly it depicts God, he's in the Holy of Holies and then he kind of, moves and then he's at the outer gate and then he just disappears. And it's just gradual leaving of God's presence. And no one notices, like God's sneaking out of town. And no one notices, and business as usual, and they're all about their business, and they're worshiping idols, and they're doing all these things inside the temple with all these idols, and they don't think anybody knows what's going on, and God is actually letting Ezekiel see all this, and then Ezekiel is telling everybody, hey, this is what's going on in Jerusalem, as if, I'm walking down the streets of Jerusalem, and they're all coming, for Like the news. Think about the news. I think about the villages, the mountain villages that I visited, and the before the internet arrived, and they had these radios. They didn't even have TV, and they would listen to the news. You know, they would gather around at a certain time of day to listen to the news and catch up after all their chores and their work, and they would try to listen and see what's going on in the rest of the world. And they would, you know, long before we had these phones that had instant, you know, gratification. And they're coming to Ezekiel's house, you know, and they're seeing what's going on. And Ezekiel is their window into seeing what's going on in Jerusalem. And he tells them, you know, this is what happened. He even, you know, he can tell them, oh, the temple was destroyed. They don't know the temple's destroyed. It takes how many, you know, months for that news to travel back, you know. So he tells them everything, and they're getting it play by play from Ezekiel, as if, you know, it's broadcast by, you know, satellite through CNN or something, you know, that you know, they're getting it through Ezekiel, and he's explaining to them everything that's going on, and he tells them that God has left, you know, and God's out of there, and he's not there. So they understand that, you know, the people have swapped. And they've turned the house of God into an abomination, and they have the idols inside there, and they're no longer worshiping God, so that when he leaves, they don't even notice. It's like God sneaks out, and they don't even know he disappeared. He just left the building, and no one realizes it because they're still involved in, they're participating in their idols, but they've lost any contact or participation with God, and they don't realize that he's left, and they just carry on as if he's still there. They have no idea he left. But Ezekiel's telling the people in Babylon, hey, God left. And then when the temple gets destroyed, it's because God wasn't there. Well, where is God? Well, obviously he's in heaven, but he's chosen to be with Ezekiel in Babylon. That's where God's at. God's in Babylon. Why? Because God is behind the Babylonian army and their victories, not Marduk. God is. Again, when Habakkuk, you know, Habakkuk said, hey, what's going on here? You're all this injustice and you're doing nothing. No, I'm doing it. Really? What are you doing? I'm sending the Babylonians. Well, that's worse. You know, what are you doing with it? Sending them? That's terrible. That's even worse. What they'll do, you know. But God's saying, I'm behind it, and I will fix things, and I'll make things right. And I'm doing it prophetically, and I'm using people and the humans of this world to do my bidding. And if I can't get my own people to do what I want, I'll get somebody else. I'll get foreigners to do it for me, and they'll do it. They'll do what I want. And now that Israel or Judah has become the enemies of God, then I'll use the Babylonians to destroy my enemies, because they no longer participate with me. They're participating in idols. And so they, you know, they're doing all these things thinking they're worshiping God, but they're worshiping idols. They're worshiping other gods, worshiping other things. So the same thing is present here, that we have these magical bands that, instead of the tefillin, now we have magical bands, and these bands are doing different things, and we need to explore that. Now, Agrod, when he approaches this text in Ezekiel, and he finds in it, he's one of the ones that originally found the magical knots and bands that have found in the Babylonian library incantations. Okay, and there's so many accounts of magical practices among primitive peoples and popular superstitions, according to which someone can try to get by with bad fate and ward off evil by tying anything from like palm leaves or bark or wool around their joints. And diseases can be cured by tying knots that are threaded to even the groin area, the head, the neck, limbs of the patients, in hopes of trying to avert them dying from the sickness. We have rhyming prayers and Jewish rituals that are frequently referred to in this connection, that seem to have this magical power about them and serve as protection against evil spirits. And there's connection again to the amulets, even that we go back to Matthew 23:5, and there's some sort of sense of a prophylactic nature against magic. Remember, the whole premise behind Doctor Strange is that he is protecting the earth from the mystical powers, in a sense. And so it's this idea of protection And then, of course, Marvel extends it to the Avengers, who protect the Earth from other threats, and the Guardians of the Galaxy. And so it's this whole idea of, in Doctor Strange, that he is using spells and using magic and using his powers as a prophylactic or protection against those evil forces. And so these tefillin, or small capsules containing pieces of parchment inscribed with text in the Torah, are fastened with thongs on the forehead and halfway up the left forearm. And according to the prescription for attaching it to the arm, the thongs are wound 7 times around the arm, then 3 times around the middle and ring finger, which is particularly reminiscent of the prescription for magical bindings. So the tefillin that we've been talking about are done exactly in the same nature as these magical bindings in the ancient Near Eastern text from West Asia. And so the head veils evidently also covered the body, since they had to be adapted to fit the size of those who wore them. So here he makes comparison to the practice of wrapping the person who performs a magical operation in veils or cloths so as to envelop them in all the power that's concealed within it. These pieces, these garments, these threaded garments, are endued with the power, much like when Elijah's mantle falls upon Elisha at his calling in 1 Kings 19. And so this is still understood that this has power. And we talked about the instances where Jesus' garments do much the same. Furthermore, the transmission of sacred power through which the priests ministered in the temple by touching the robes in which they ministered is referred later in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 19. But it's not by the prophet Ezekiel, okay, and referred to as a counterpart. That people tried such practices, in other words, to hunt or catch souls, that is, to get others underneath their power that we've been describing, shows their unbounded confidence in the effectiveness of this art. So the prophet seems to be denouncing those who deliberately indulge in that type of magic for their careless or brutal conduct, and taking upon themselves either to kill or to keep alive. Again, it's either or. They're doing one way or the other. They're trying to kill someone by getting them, cursing them with sickness, or they're trying to bless them when they're being attacked by someone else who's doing the same. So it's kind of like in The Lord of the Rings when you have Gandalf and Saruman, and they're both trying to cast their spells one against the other. This does not mean that their magic aimed directly at bringing about death of the victim, but the enchantresses did undoubtedly claim to be able, by their magic powers, to deliver those menaced by the powers of death and left those disdained their aid defenseless in the face of death. It gives me the idea here that they're kind of like Balaam, and they're enchantresses or prophetesses or diviners or whatever. They're out for hire. They're for sale. They're selling their services, almost like an insurance salesman will sell you insurance. And if you don't buy my insurance and something bad happens to you, I wasn't there to protect you. I wasn't there to be your bodyguard, to be your protector against the evil that's going to happen to you. So you want to hire me. So if you hire me, I can cause evil in others, but also at the same time, if you hire me and use my services, I can protect you when someone else is trying to attack you or some other form of evil is upon you. And it goes back to this idea, I think, if I understand it right, that perhaps in the ancient Near East and even today in the East, we have peoples worshiping multiple gods. I mean, the Hindu religion has over 330 million gods, and it's impossible for someone to have allegiance to a single god. And I've talked about this on the channel before, but, you can only have allegiance to what? One, maybe 2 gods or something. You kind of, honor certain gods. It's kind of like your favorite sports team in a sense. There's one team you follow, and you want them to go to the finals, but then, when your team's out or whatever, you'll root for another team. So it's almost in the sense that as you worship one God, and you're faithful to that one God, then you expect that one God on your behalf to go to the other gods and kind of work out a deal for you, as if there's this, again, divine council, or there's this UN, council meeting, and your ambassador speaks on your behalf for your country to the other bodies and tries to convince them, hey, do this for my people, So when you're worshiping that God, your God goes before all the other gods, and on your behalf will petition the other gods on your behalf. And so when you hire these, enchantresses, they're going to use their magic to protect you. And they can go against the magic of others. At the same time, they can possibly do some offense too, and cause some harm. But the more the idea is, again, this prophylactic nature, this protection, that we're protecting you. And so you're wearing these magical bands to protect. And so the problem is, in Jerusalem, what are they doing? They're worshiping other gods. They're doing practices that are from other religions, and they're doing all that inside God's house in the temple. And along with that, you have, again, people participating with these women, and instead of doing what God designed in the tefillin, they've got their own version of it that, it's among the masses. This is not a unique idea. It's not as if God dropped these ideas out of heaven and nobody else practices these things. No, these are practices that everybody in the ancient Near Eastern, West Asian context is somehow practicing. They're all trafficking in these basic components and ideas. And so where you have the Jews doing the tefillin, you have these doing these magical bands, and they serve a very similar purpose. And what makes one good and one bad is the sourcing. One man's prayer is another man's magic. I'm praying to God because my source is Yahweh. So because I'm praying to the right source, then it's prayer. But if you're praying to your God and it's the wrong source, then you're doing magic, because magic is bad. That's how we kind of parsed it somewhat, that people that do things that are against what we believe is right, then they're doing bad, so we use a different connotation, a different word. So they're doing magic, they're cursing, and I'm blessing. And the problem is the sourcing here. So they're using similar type of mechanism, sympathetic magic, to achieve a similar purpose in protection from evil. So you pay these women to make these things for you, and it's by their magic that then this happens. And anyone who's seen the movie The Green Knight knows that, the Green Knight's mother, Morgan Fay makes this thread that he puts about his body that offers him protection. And it's a powerful magic that, nothing can break, as long as he's wearing that thread about him as protection. So they say, you can hire us and we can cause someone to get sick unto death, or someone who's sick unto death, we can use our power to defend them against. So they can work either way. It's an either way. So it's very ambiguous here in what they can do with their magical bands. And it's all juxtaposed against what's going on with God and the tefillin and the prayers there by the Jewish practices to bring about life. So often, too, they were seriously harmed by paralyzing fear induced by the dark doings of these witches. So this is the idea. They're dabbling, communing. They're along the liminality between life and death. And they even go on into the dead. And there are places where this relates to what some people would consider necromancy. But there are parts of the Bible where we have this idea that is probably best exemplified today in the Roman Catholicism, in this thing known as the communion of the saints, or the communion of the holy ones, where again, that there's some kind of communion with those who've gone on before us. And there are Jewish practices of being gathered with my father's bones, in a sense, where they keep the bones and they practice rituals related to honoring the dead in a special way that is not prohibited by the Bible. So there are bad ways that you can do this through sorcery, necromancy, and through the wrong means, but there are correct means by which certain practices that we cannot get to in this video. And what's going on in Ezekiel is someone else is manifesting these things, but then we give instances like Elijah's mantle where it is good. So you have good instances of this and you have bad instances of this. And in the Ezekiel passage, it's showing the mere opposite through this magic of the original product of the tefillin. So it gives you an idea. And again, in the ancient world, don't forget that the concept of how do you know what something is often best by describing what it's not and giving the opposite. So there's a good way to understand a word if you can understand its antonym. And so these are the opposite. So in this passage in Ezekiel, it is Jost who makes the connection between these garments and the tallit, the Jewish prayer shawl, and the tefillin, as in the Jewish phylacteries. So it's interesting that this connection is directly made. And there's some sense that what's going on here is, in a sense, legitimate, and we're going to talk about that now. Going back to Amori, she notes how two scholars have argued that this idea of soul can specifically refer to a spirit of the dead or a ghost. So they're trafficking in communion with the dead. And again, there are legitimate ways to do this. And so that's not the problem here either. So we need to flesh this out a bit. Now, Korpel has noted that in Ugaritic texts, the Rephaim, concerning the Rephaim, that in Canaanite religion there existed a form of magic which enabled man to call up the spirits of the dead in forms of birds, in the form of birds. So this bird language here is used throughout the neighboring nations to reflect this idea of the dead again. And so you're gonna again get that connection. You know, maybe the ancient idea of the phoenix, in a sense, you know, also has that in view or something. So as an example. Furthermore, Vendatorn says to communicate. The women use these means to communicate with the spirits of the dead. Now, the dead, the latter are called souls by Ezekiel, according to a gloss in the text. Meant as a clarification, they are flying souls, an expression based on the idea that the dead can manifest themselves in the shape of birds. So this is a cross scholarship that this is occurring. So it's not odd. And then furthermore, Hamori says that the sense of making spirits of the dead live here must refer to necromantic communication. So again, the dead again get another voice, like when Saul sought Samuel. Samuel lives again in the sense that the witch at Endor was able to communicate with Samuel, which is exactly what Saul wanted, because he couldn't talk to God, so he knows that he can talk to Samuel, and Samuel talks to God. So it's again communion. And again, there's nothing said in the Bible specifically where this is condemned, what Saul does, in a sense. It's amazing how it's left ambiguous for the reader to note that there is these practices that hopefully one day I'll get into it with another video more specifically and tie this, you know, to understanding. And so what's interesting to note, if we go back to the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32, verse 39, it says here, "See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no Elohim beside me. I kill and make alive. I wound and I heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand." Okay, so this sense is that when we're dealing with this, that we are in participation with Yahweh, and Yahweh is the supreme Elohim. There's no one higher. He's the Most High. And so in order to do these things, again, in a right way, according to God's will, it must be because of the divine counsel is permitting it to happen. So perhaps that's what's going on with Saul. Divine counsel. Yahweh has determined that this is kosher in a sense. It's not taboo because they're going to allow it because it plays into their interest, and so it's allowable. And so there are practices where such things are allowable. But again, it's not a blanket check to do whatever you want. And so these women are making possibly a mistake, because if we go on to back up and look at verse 17, it says, "And you, son of man, set your face against the daughters of your people who prophesy out of their own hearts." Okay, so this is the problem. I want you to prophesy against them because they're doing it on their own. They don't have the approval. It's not that the fact that what they're doing is wrong. It's not the fact that they're women and doing it wrong. It's not the fact that they use the tallit or the tefillin or whatever they're using. None of that is in play here necessarily. One has to read that into the text, and maybe that's true. But again, you're reading into the text. But what we can be more comfortable saying when we look at the text is that by doing this, they didn't have God's approval to do it at that time. It goes back to like eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that Walton has discussed numerous times, represents wisdom. And it wasn't the fact that they ate of the tree of the good of knowledge of good and evil, as if the tree was bad or the fruit was bad or anything was bad, or they were never allowed to do that. No, it was God had timing. There's times that you can do it. Again, this allowing and permitting, this binding and loosing, and in certain instances it's okay, in certain instances not, and it's timing. There's timing involved into it. And so God's will for a particular situation may go one way, and then a very similar, almost exact situation in a different moment may come out with a different will from the divine counsel, from Yahweh. And so it's participation. And they have decided to do this on their own without approval from the divine counsel in this respect, in this moment, in this way, These are all things that are very common in the ancient Near East of explaining how you would do this, and this is participation in the holy ones, in the communion of saints, and all this in participation with the dead. All of this has the legitimate ways that this can be done at times, but what they're doing just happens not to be legitimate. And again, scholars have read into the text, and different people have read into the text. It's because they're women, it's because of this, it's because of that. It's not necessarily. If we take the text at face value, God has not determined at this time you can do this, and you've chosen to do it. And then you take the name of the Lord and say, "Thus saith the Lord God." Then you put God's stamp on it and say, "Okay, God has told me to do this." And then you speak for God. And that's the danger. It's kind of like in James chapter 4 where God says, you go off and do this and you go off and do that. These are not bad activities in and of themselves. And it's not necessarily that they're doing it because they're using illegitimate means or who's doing it or any of that. It's the fact that this is not what God wants you to do, and you have not consulted him, and you think that you have, and you're doing your own thing, and then you're putting God's name on it and saying, with God's stamp of approval, I'm doing this. That's the problem. They have chosen to do this, and perhaps they were successful in the past, and they've chosen to do it now, and then they were wrong because God did not give them permission to do it at this time. At the time and the way they did it. Not a blanket rule that it's always wrong. And we do that with children all the time, and they get confused because, if you have two children, I'll tell one of my children, okay, you can't do that. And then later on something comes up and I tell another child, you can do that. And then the first child goes, wait a minute, why? I thought you made a blanket rule. No, it's, again, reading the text maturely to understand that certain times something is great and at other times it's not great. And so if we look again at verse 23, then what's the outcome here? What is Ezekiel then saying from God? Therefore you shall no more see false visions, okay, and nor practice divination. It's not a blanket check against doing this. It says you have done it falsely. Again, it's false. Why? Because you said, think about if an employee does something for an employer and you represent your employer and you say something on behalf of the company or your boss that's not true. Your boss never meant that, intended that. That was not what the boss of the company wants. And you misrepresent them. Even though 100% you may feel genuine in what you're doing, you misrepresent them by saying something. And the boss goes, I never meant that or said that. That's not what I wanted at all. And so you may be genuine in what you're doing, but then the boss goes, no, this is false. I did not approve of this. And yet you went after it with so much passion because you were excited that you made one mistake when you told everyone this was by my approval, and it was not. The mistake is that you did something and took the name of the boss and used his authority to say this is legitimate when it was not, and you did not get it approved through the right authority. That's the problem here when we're talking about false. I went at great lengths in talking about this in my master's thesis, dealing with how Paul can call himself an apostle and the legitimacy he gets and where his authority comes from in relationship to the divine council. So again, they're mistaken in what they're doing. Not that they doing it or the means they use to do it or any of that is wrong. It's the fact that they are not legitimate and they don't have God's authority for this specific thing at this time. Otherwise, they're more than likely had been successful in the past, which they mislead people as a result because people could have trusted them in the past, and now they have misused that position, and they lose their integrity because by nature of their position they have done something that's not legitimate, and then they lose integrity, and that's what's at stake here. You put my name on it and it wasn't mine to do. Now, I may have in the past said for you to do it and you did it and it was successful, because there's a comparison here in this part of the chapter with men in the previous part of the chapter, in the earlier part of the chapter of 13. And, it's again, they're allowed to do these things, but it's a comparison between what often is done, and then sometimes you can't do that, depending on the situation or circumstance. And so they have chosen to usurp Yahweh's authority in rebellion by doing something quite legitimate, using legitimate means perhaps, but at that very moment, it wasn't something that God said to do, or it wasn't God's will. It wasn't the will by the decree of the divine council. And then they went ahead and did it anyway, and perhaps they were deceived themselves and thought. And then they put Yahweh's name on it as if, okay, God spoke to me. God said it. This is, and they were mistaken. And so God then, is going to make sure that I will deliver my people out of your hand, and you shall know that I am the Lord, because you have. So what we see here then is, again, what we've been trying to exemplify across this channel is there are legitimate ways to participate with Yahweh, and there's the ban and the privation. And so the end result here is just like Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden and no longer could participate in Eden and that fellowship and participation there, they had to go out. These women now are also then privated in a sense because they're disconnected. And again, Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 5, the adulterer who is sleeping with his father's wife. And Paul says, this can't be done. So again, it's along the spectrum of participation within the community, within the holy ones, the communion of saints, that whole idea, and it's privation. And so that's what's in view here. And they made a mistake of thinking that they were, They were mistaken. They really thought that they heard from God, and they didn't, and they're going to pay a price. How long they're going to pay a price again? Can they be restored? That's another discussion. Perhaps the easiest illustration to try to make this work is you have someone like a police officer who is allowed in the line of duty to do things that most people are not allowed to do. And yet, if that police officer chooses to do certain things in an illegitimate way, they can be held accountable and either be placed on suspension or lose their job entirely, or themselves get arrested, face dire consequences. And we don't have enough data in Ezekiel 13 necessarily to know how far this goes. And maybe we do have some data to lean in one way or another, but I'm trying to generally explain the whole paradigm rather than just a specific event, because different events are going to have different outcomes. And one of the things I've seen in modern media is, this Doctor Strange, and he does all these hand movements and he does all these gestures, and he's got things tied around his hands, and he's got these vestments about him, and he uses all these things. He uses a cloak to levitate, and that cloak has some power imbued in it. He has all these little devices, and he casts all these spells, and he travels, and does all these things. And so some of that, in a sense, is tied to this. And so in the modern way of viewing things in modern media, they're trying to exemplify a lot of these things, to show us these things. And you can see through magic, and you can see through spells, and you can see through items, and you can see how this works. And, this is what's being talked about mythologically in the Bible. And there's some good ways of doing this that is right, like, again, like just mantle, and then the tefillin, and then there's bad ways, like those that Ezekiel's describing, where they've abused it and done the opposite. And so there is contact, in a sense, with the dead that is well. And the funny thing about it, the witch of Endor, who is allowed to bring up Samuel, in a sense, and that's interesting. And how Joseph wants his bones to be with those of his fathers, because he believes there's something going on in the communion of the saints, whereby his bones need to be with those of his fathers, because there is something in correlation to that. And it's quite necessary. And so there's something that's beyond the liminal state of moving beyond. So once this life is over, what we move into, the idea in the Old Testament of afterlife and all that's not a part of this series that we're doing, that maybe perhaps we can dig into in another episode or series. So there are appropriate means by which this can be done and is done. And then there are those that are not sanctioned by God, obviously, that do it improperly. And it's through the descriptions in the Bible and other places of the improper that we learn what is proper and what is taboo and what is accepted and what one should be bound from and what someone is loose to do. And so it gets quite tricky when you start getting down to the specifics, and there's a lot of ambiguity, and there's a lot of things that we don't know because we're limited by what's extant to us. And so we can't make too many calls here, but it's quite interesting what we can pull out, in a sense, and understand. And it's quite fascinating. Now, as we move forward in this series, we can begin to work with these parameters between what is taboo, unacceptable, and what is kosher, what is acceptable, and what is permitted and allowed, and what is banned. And we can move through the evolutionary thought that progresses in the ideas that are going to follow when we talk about binding and loosing. And it's pretty interesting because you have debate on both sides, and sometimes people try to sort through it in different ways. And so you have the concept of the supernatural that they want to avoid, magic, the protection of evil powers or spirits and all that. And some people don't want to deal in that because I don't believe in supernatural spiritual warfare of any kind, that it never existed, you know. And then there's the other extreme where the rabbis go into all these codes of religion and the rule of life, and some people try to make a dichotomy and separate the two out as if they don't belong together. And you can begin to see in what we're trying to do here is kind of a mix of both and trying to see how they can work together and how they come together. And so join us in the next episode as we begin to unpack this concept of the binding and the loosening. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes and videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.